طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا إن شاء الله تعالى to this first lesson of Isaghoji إن شاء الله تعالى, studying علم المنطق, an important subject. I did put out a little video highlighting just how important this subject is. I know that there will be many of you that have experience with the subject, and there will be most certainly some of you that do not have any experience with the subject. And so inshallah this is perhaps going to be more of a focused study inshallah ta'ala, in terms of trying to get to grips with the absolute fundamentals inshallah ta'ala. And so for that reason we selected Isaghoji as the course, as the text. As many of you will be aware, Al-Imam Al-Jalil Athiruddin Al-Abhari rahimahullah ta'ala was a very important rationalist scholar. When I say rationalist, let me be clear, I don't mean by that in any way that he was a Mu'tazili per se, although he definitely did have some very philosophical positions. Now, one of the things that makes him actually so important, rahimahullah ta'ala, is that he is a student of Al-Imam Fakhruddin Ar-Razi. And for those of you that are familiar with the development of Kalam, Al-Imam Ar-Razi is considered to be the beginning of Al-Mutaakhirin or Al-Mutaakhirun. And the reason for that is because of his inclusion of more philosophy into theological works. And so Razi is basically very important when it comes to that development of Sunni theology, and Athiruddin Al-Abhari is one of his main students, and he is considered to be one of the main people that develops his school. He is considered to be somebody that makes his school more widespread, systematizes it, so to speak, and writes in his style. And so that Razian school has a lot to do with Athiruddin Al-Abhari as well, which is definitely interesting to say the least. طيب. Now, bear with me 1 second. Now, if I could just say a couple of things about Athiruddin Al-Abhari in particular. One is that he writes a number of very, very important books. One of those books is the Isaghoji, which we'll talk more about later. The other is his Hidayatul Hikmah. Hidayatul Hikmah is, I could show you an old nuskha. This is the print from the Dars Nizami, sort of the old prints of Hidayatul Hikmah. Now the reason why I showed you that is because it's not very big. It's actually a very small matan in hikmah, in philosophy, but it becomes really, really important. It becomes super important. In fact, it attracts huge amounts of commentaries and glosses. In fact, there's many, but three of the main, or certainly three of the most important books of philosophy within the Farangi Mahal tradition, meaning the tradition of the subcontinent, the philosophy one is called Hidayatul Hikmah. Hidayatul Hikmah. And so three of the main works that are studied, of the many, there are many more of course, within the subcontinent in the 17th, 18th century in particular, which is the beginning of this Farangi Mahal tradition, the tradition of the Dars Nizami. You have a book called Hamdallah, which is a commentary. You have a book called Mebzi by Al-Maybuzi, Mir Maybuzi, which is again a commentary on the Hidayatul Hikmah. And you have others. You have Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad sayati. But you have many commentaries that are written on the Hidayatul Hikmah. Abdul Haq Al-Khairabadi famously has a commentary on Hidayatul Hikmah. So it's a really important, I mean, the reason why I'm mentioning these things is to give you an idea that there are certain authors that are just loved by everybody, absolutely loved by everybody. And because their works are so important. Likewise, the Isaghoji. The Isaghoji is that matan. It's very, very short. Inshallah, for those that are joining in on Wednesday, you'll be given, and there are many translations actually available in English, but you'll be given our own one, inshallah ta'ala. And so it's a very small matan. It's not very big, but deeply packed with meaning, and very important aspects of logic are included within that. So that's just a little bit about the author to give you an idea of how important he is, his works are, how important his teachers were, the commentaries on those books, just to give you an idea that really when we're studying the Isaghoji, we're in good hands. Now, also, by the way, I should say that not just were there commentaries and glosses put on the book, but also you had the likes of Al-Akhdari, the great Maliki Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala. Al-Akhdari, famous for his, anyone that's familiar with Maliki jurisprudence will know that actually one of the first texts that you're going to study is the matan of Al-Akhdari. He writes a poem, and what he does is he turns the matan of Isaghoji into verse format. And there's some of the verses that when we're looking at the issue of whether studying logical is permissible in the Sharia or not, we'll talk about some of those verses of how he explained those verses. Rahimahullah ta'ala. Al-khulfu fi, for those of you that are aware maybe with the Sulam, al-khulfu fi jawaz al-ishtighali به على ثلاثة أقوال فابن الصلاح والنواوي حرم وقال قوم ينبغي أن يعلم, etc. So he has this whole way of explaining the Isaghoji, and it's absolutely fantastic. And so what generally people do, not in the subcontinent but certainly in Syria, Egypt and other places, is they memorize the Sulam al-Munawraq. They memorize this matan because it's just a way of keeping all of those qawa'id and those rules in one's mind, a bit like studying the Alfiya of Ibn Malik in grammar, for example. They used to turn into verse these texts because they were able to then record them to memory, and then they could have that istihdar, that ability to bring it back whenever they wanted. طيب. So that's just a short introduction into the author himself. Let's, inshallah ta'ala, get on with the text itself, inshallah. What we're going to try to do for this is we're going to try to keep, again, questions to the end, inshallah ta'ala, just so that we can have a complete, journey through, inshallah ta'ala. Today's lesson, again, it is a taster session. It's because personally, I want to revive this tradition, and I want people to re-access the tools of learning. And I think for Muslims in particular, these things are very important. Kalam, the studying of theology, the studying of the rational sciences, the studying of rhetoric, of balagha, of all of these things, they're so important ultimately in preservation of one's own creed and theology. And perhaps sometimes some people that are very new to Islamic studies may not really get that. But these things are fundamental. They are really important. And you'll see as you go on, if you want to understand Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh, you need logic. If you want to understand theology, you need logic. If you want to understand how to navigate the news, you talk about fake news today, you need logic. If you want to be able to have a proper meaningful conversation, you need logic. It's just one of those things. It's one of those subjects that you cannot do without it. So here on the first slide you have, and we'll read from this matan later. This is one of the manuscripts. It's actually not the one that we used for the translation that hopefully you'll be getting by Wednesday, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But we did use this, but we used other manuscripts, particularly those that are found with commentaries. I should mention also before we begin that with regards to commentaries on the Isaghoji itself. So we talked about Hidayatul Hikmah. Isaghoji has attracted many commentaries. Many commentaries and glosses. Some of them, and let me give you an example of, this is one. This is called Al-Fawaid Al-Fannariya, and this is by one of the great Ottoman scholars, Mullah Shamsuddin Al-Fannari, buried in Bursa. His comes from a lineage. Hamza, Mullah Hamza al-Fannari is one of the great Ottoman Akbarian scholars, has a famous, his Misbah al-Uns, which I have a commentary on Al-Kunawi, again, the student disciple of Shaykh Ibn Arabi, again, great scholars. So this is one of the great commentaries called Al-Fawaid al-Fannariya by Shamsuddin al-Fannari, rahimahullah ta'ala, buried up on a little hill in Bursa that you can still go and visit should you know where to look. One of the most important commentaries, in my opinion, one of the finest commentaries to study. And for those of you here that have Arabic and you would like to use a commentary to go, although I promised myself that in the duration of this course that I was going to try to keep this as introductory as possible. Sometimes that becomes a little bit difficult to do just because of some of the students in the class that just want more and require more, but I'm going to try my best to hold myself to account to do that. Perhaps not been so successful in doing that in other lessons, but this is the commentary that you want to use. There are many commentaries, of course, many commentaries on the Isaghoji, probably one of the most commented on logic works in all of our tradition and history. But this one by Al-Miknasi, called Mughni al-Tullab, is simply amazing. This print, Dar al-Taqwa, is a good print. The other, there's another print, I forget the publishing house now, is probably in some ways better. But I really like this print as well by Dar al-Taqwa. If you want to get it, it also comes with the Risala in Adab al-Bahthi wal-Munadhara in dialectics. So Mughni al-Tullab is a must. Now, for those that may want some hashiyas on the Mughni, meaning a gloss on the Mughni al-Tullab, some extra reading, meaning another layer on the Mughni al-Tullab, then you can have a look at Sayf al-Ghulab by Al-Urduni. Here, this is it here. I don't know if you can see it. Probably the camera's going to show it the other way. But this is called with Sayf al-Ghulab, Maktab down in the south of the country in Turkey. These are the famous Diyarbakir, Maradin, that area in South Turkey. And also you have this one, which is called Ithaf al-Tullab Bihalli al-Fadhi Mughni al-Tullab. This is a very small hashia where the focus, this is actually I think a group of students that put this together from the madrasa. Again, this is Maktaba Hashimi here in Turkey. If any of you are familiar with the publishing houses here, Maktaba Hashimi under the famous Sheikh Abdul Baqi, who passed away only a couple of months ago, rahimahullah ta'ala. So this is Maktaba Hashimi. So this is a very light hashia on Mughni al-Tullab. I really like Mughni, and there are many, and I have made it a personal goal of collecting as many commentaries on Isaghoji and do have a fair few. And if I could say, Al-Fawaid al-Fannariya is obviously what it is because of who the author is. But if there was somebody that was really just kickstarting their journey off in logic, then I recommend deeply that Mughni al-Tullab is the book for you. طيب. Okay, so now let's move on, inshaAllah ta'ala. Okay, again, remember, for those of you that have access to logic from before, you're going to have to remain with me, and we're going to go through this from the very basics. So this is a nice quote from Chesterton. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He was a Christian in the early 19th century. There's in fact a picture of him, and an interesting fella, a Christian, was an Anglican, became a Catholic, was very strong in philosophy and logic, had a very interesting career as a column writer, a very interesting character, also a novelist, Dr. Brown, if those of you familiar with maybe some history of British drama. He created certain characters. He was a novelist, a brilliant writer. He was a fantastic and brilliant mind. He also did have some positions that have caused him a lot of criticism. But anyway, interesting fella. But this quote I really liked of his. I've always liked this quote of his, where he begins to explain really what mantiq is all about, what logic is all about. And he says, logic and truth have very little to do with each other. Logic is concerned merely with the fidelity and accuracy with which a certain process is performed, a process which can be performed with any materials, with any assumptions. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. You can be as logical about griffins and basilisks, I think you pronounce them, for those of you that perhaps we're interested in Harry Potter, we know better how to pronounce that, as about sheep and pigs. Logic then is not necessarily an instrument for finding out truth. On the contrary, truth is a necessary instrument for using logic. For using it, that is, for the discovery of further truth. Briefly, you can only find truth with logic if you have already found truth without it. That's an important distinction that he's making between what's called formal logic and material logic, or what's called minor logic and what's called major logic. The idea of formal logic is to do with the actual argument itself, the structure of the argument, the form. And we're going to look at things like the ashkal arba'a, the four figures. We're going to look at the adrub, the moods. These different aspects of the actual argument itself when you're making logic. I would assume that, again, for those of you that have experience with logic, that's fine. For those of you that are complete beginners, hopefully you would have seen my little video where I summarized the entire point of logic, and so I can pick up right from there. Now, to say that ultimately the goal of logic is to argument. That's why we study words, we study sentences, i.e. statements, in order to make premises of an argument. That's the ultimate goal, to make that argument, to notice a valid from invalid argument, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, that's an simplification, and there's huge amounts of detail there, but that really is the essence of logic. Now, formal logic is looking at that structure. Material logic is looking at the content of the premise. So if, for example, I give you an example here, all men have 20 legs. Zayd is a man, therefore Zayd has 20 legs. This is a perfectly valid syllogism. That conclusion, based upon the rules of logic, has entailed a valid conclusion. So from the perspective of formal logic, that is correct. But from the perspective of material logic, this is a problem. Why? Because the premises are not true. All men do not have 20 legs. Now, it may be that premise 2 is correct, the minor premise here in this case, and I'll explain all of those terms as we go along, what a major premise is, a minor premise is, what the excluded middle is, etc. But Zayd is a man, that's true. Premise 2 is fine. But premise 1, there's an assumption. There's an assumption. So in order for you to have a true argument, it has to ultimately, it could be that at the very beginning it doesn't, but ultimately it has to fall back upon absolute knowledge, upon first principles, upon riyat, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. Meaning that the knowledge from the premise has to give you necessary knowledge, which means what? Which means that logic isn't really about finding truth, it's about going from what they call al-ma'lumat to al-majhulat. It's moving from what's known, meaning I know premise 1, for example, the universe is originated, for example. I know that. Why? Because I have a certain understanding of the world, of cosmology, whatever it may be, that has proven that to me. Premise 2, whatever is originated must have a cause. Because obviously if it's originated, it comes from nothing. And so therefore there must be a cause that brought that into being. So now premise 1 is true. Premise 2 is true. Therefore the universe must have a cause. So that conclusion that follows from those premises is both valid because it's correct according to the rules of logic that we will be learning, but it's also true. So from those perspectives of formal, of major and minor logic, this is ultimately what we want, which is just a valid argument, true argument. And there's a whole bunch of detail that's going to go into trying to get that, to achieve that in a way that is good and positive. Now, today's session, again, as I say, a taster session, is more about getting into what is logic, trying to understand it, understanding its philosophy and what it means. What's the hukm shari'i of it, what's its relation to other subjects, etc. What we call al-mabadi al-ashara. Anytime a subject is begun in the Islamic tradition, the ulama would normally begin with these al-mabadi al-ashara, which is to explain the 10 fundamental things that you need to know about every single subject. So let's go through them, and we won't take too long, inshallah ta'ala, to get through these. First and foremost, the had, the definition. What is logic? Definition, so there's a few different definitions there. Jacques Maritain, I don't know, I do have his text. If you can get hold of it on logic, I think it's in England. I think that text is in England. It is an amazing book in logic. Why? Again, for those of you that dibble and dabble, or those that are students of knowledge, etc., you would know that trying to get hold of good books in logic in English isn't very difficult, actually. There's some very, very good ones now. There's Keeler, which is probably the most famous one. There's many others. But this one in particular is really good. Why? Because it's structured like a matan. Whereas if you were to read Socratic or Aristotelian logic or Socratic logic by Keeler, it's very wordy. It's brilliant, but it's very wordy. For a beginner or even a sort of an upper foundational student, someone that's maybe done a matan or two, even then that text is still quite heavy, right? It's just a lot. And so it's kind of because for the most part, many people, not everybody, many tullab al-ilm, students of knowledge that have studied in madrasas, darulooms, or with mashayikh in the Arab world, they know the terms, the istilahat in Arabic. But what they don't know are the in English. And so when they read it in English, it's like studying a brand new subject. It's easier for them to read it in the Arabic. Why? Because they're used to hearing in the Arabic. It's like trying to learn nahu, for those that know grammar, in English. It's hard because you're used to those terms of marfu', khaft, madzum, whatever it may be. But if somebody used to start saying nominative, accusative, jussive, it starts to become a little bit, people get used to it. For that reason, this book is really, really good because it's a very simple matan in English. So I recommend it. Here's his definition. Logic is the art that guides the process of reasoning, facilitating orderly and correct thought. Notice, it's not telling you it's going to give you truth. It's telling you it will allow you to reach truth, to go from known premises to unknown conclusions. Definition by At-Tabib Ibn al-Hajj al-Fasi. Logic is a science that helps us derive new knowledge from what is known. What I just told you now. The third definition, logic is the science that ensures our mental processes, conception. You can also translate this as simple apprehension, tasawwur, which we'll talk about, judgment, tasdiq, and reasoning, qiyas, which are all these terms that we will cover in this course, inshallah ta'ala. Proceed in an orderly and consistent manner towards truth. Conception. First, you know what a subject is. I know a word, Zayd. I know what Zayd is. And then I make a judgment. I know another word, another concept, which is insan, man, human being. I know what Zayd is. I know what human is. It's universal. I know to whom it applies. I understand what that means. It's a species. Okay, I understand that now. Now I can make a judgment, and I can say, well, Zayd is a human. Zayd is man. I can make that relationship because I know what this simple apprehension is. I know what that is, and if I have knowledge of the relationship between the two, I can make that judgment. So there's a compound of four things here at the very least, which we'll talk about again when we do that concept of judgment. So the first thing is I have to know what I'm looking at. What is Zayd? What is human? And then I have to know whether I can make that judgment truthfully and with certainty. And once I can do that, can I use Zayd is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Zayd is mortal. Now I can make my reasoning. So that's the point that he's making here for the definition. Now in terms of the name, that's a lot of information here, so I broke it down for you. In Arabic, logic is known as mantiq, from the word nutuq. Literally means to speak or to articulate, which encompasses the ability to speak, comprehend universals, and have the power of comprehension. Why is it called mantiq? Ultimately, the manatiqa, meaning the logicians, are only interested in ma'ani, in meanings, because this is all cognitive discourse. Really, this is about the cognitive faculty of man. This is about our own ability to reason and think. But why it's called mantiq, which for some of the scholars is actually ismul makan, for others it's mastar mimi, but the idea is that the place where you articulate those thoughts and that reasoning is ultimately on the tongue. Therefore, the tongue becomes important. So that's the name mantiq. Al-Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala referred to logic as the touchstone of knowledge. Ghazali is super important in logic. We'll talk more about that in a minute when we look a little bit about the history. And the criterion of knowledge, highlighting its importance in discerning true knowledge. In fact, al-Ghazali said a famous statement that anyone that doesn't have the knowledge of logic, la lahum fil ilm. When you consider him or such a person to have any authority in knowledge at all, because they don't even have the mabadi, the foundational tools of reasoning, of learning, of knowledge. It is also called the key to knowledge and the balance. So miftahul ilm or miftahul ulum, the key to all knowledge, and the balance, al-mizan. It's called, like in the verse of the Quran in Surah Shu'ara, wazinu bil qistas al-mustaqim. In fact, Al-Ghazali calls one of his books Al-Qistas Al-Mustaqim. It's that perfect balance, because it measures the soundness of speech, which is ultimately the soundness of reasoning. A logic is referred to as the upright scale. Again, as I mentioned, Al-Qistas Al-Mustaqim. Aristotle named it analytics, prior and posterior, and divided it into major, material, and minor formal logic based on subject matter, which we've talked about. Formal logic deals with the validity of the syllogism's form and structure, whilst material logic covers the actual content of the syllogism. Symbolic or mathematical logic emerged in the late 19th century and has become, so Bertrand Russell and others that you may have heard of, has become more dominant, especially in computer programming. This is more about numbers and being able to include many more premises. But traditional logic, which is still the basis of our legal system, and you'll see, hopefully through the course, I'll give you examples of usul al-fiqh. In fact, Al-Ghazali, one of his at least 5 books that he has in logic, one of them he dedicates to tatbiq. He shows logic to Islamic legal theory, to the building. Fascinating, isn't it? So it remains indispensable despite the rise of symbolic logic. It's also common sense. Logic is common sense. It's there in algebra. It's just giving laws. Then we have the subject, the mawdu'. The subject of logic encompasses the 3 operations of the mind: conceptualization or simple apprehension, judgment, tasdiq, and reasoning through argumentation and demonstration. Should someone memorize the Sulam or the Isaghoji if they want to? If they have the himmah, they should memorize both. But with the Sulam, you can sing it. What is the thamara, the benefit? Logic is foundational. Al-Ghazali views logic as an introductory discipline to all knowledge. Essential mastery. He suggests that one who has not mastered logic cannot be trusted with knowledge. Clarity and reasoning. Logic fosters clarity of thought and enhances reasoning skills, aiding in effective communication. So it's actually that's why some of the scholars, they actually say that mantiq is independent as a subject. It's not related to any other subject. Why? Because it actually underpins every other subject, but it itself is an independent. It's like ilm al-fara'id, inheritance law. It really doesn't have a lot to do with the other abwab, the chapters of jurisprudence, of fiqh, of law. Whereas the others normally intertwine, like tahara and salah, they all sort of intertwine, but with fara'id it's separate. Likewise with logic, linked to all of the subject. In fact, it is the foundation of all of the subjects, but it is actually an independent subject. Like, for example, usul al-fiqh and fiqh are not separable. You study usul al-fiqh to understand the furu', the subsidiary issues of Islamic law. That's how you understand how the madhahib differ, why they differ, etc. How they understand language and wada', and how they appreciate the nuance of the language, what is their epistemic paradigms, what is the relationship between the different sources of Islamic law, which laws can abrogate, sources can abrogate other sources if they can, if they can, how much can they do so. All of that differing is ultimately linked to those subsidiary issues of Islamic law. Whereas with logic, it really underpins everything within religion and even in general life as well. What are the masail? What are the topics of logic? Minor or formal logic, as we talked about. Simple apprehensions. Again, we will explain all of these terms over the coming weeks. Simple apprehension, at-tasawwarat, what does that mean? We will talk about it. Terms. What are al-mufradat? Definitions. What are at-ta'rifat? Divisions. What are at-taqsimat? We will talk about all of those. Judgments, at-tasdiq or al-hukm. Prepositions. We will look at al-qadaya. What is a qadiyya? We will look at varieties, simple, compound, affirmative, negative. We will look at categorical, hypothetical, modal, all of that, al-qadiyya, al-shartiyya, all of these type of things. We will look at istithna'iyya, all of that we will look at bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Syllogism, and its divisions, induction. We will look at deductive reasoning, istiqra, tam, naqis. All of those terms, the whole point of studying Isaghoji is it really is an explanation of terms. In fact, the Isaghoji is just terms. It's not really engaging in mantiq per se. It's not like the Sharut Tahdhib or something like that. It just is a book of terms. Okay, another from the Masail, from the topics: material or major logic, contents of a syllogism, categories, 5 predicables, al-kulliyat al-khams, at those. The 5 arts, what I'll call as-sana'at al-khamsa, and we're looking at logical fallacies, topics, related subjects. Sometimes these are included in the sana'at, like dialectics. We will be looking at rhetoric. We will be looking at psychology, cosmology, criticism, and the poetics, what Aristotle called the poetics, ash-shi'r. We'll be looking at al-khitabiyat, ash-shi'r. All of that is going to come at tamthil. It's a really fascinating subject when trying to understand what epistemic value each one of these different types of things have. So these are some of the broad topics that will be covered. Istimdad, sources. Where do we take logic from? Logic is the introductory science deriving its sources from observation and intuition. Its basic tools are intuited concepts and the propositions stemming from them. Concepts involve the mind's abstraction of universals from particulars. Obviously, from a philosophical point of view, we can talk about that. Enabling definition, we won't talk about that. That's in Kalam. Well, that's a discussion for a different subject. But for now, let's say that the idea of looking at multiple individual things in the universe, what we call instantiations in the world, we can sort of make a kulli judgment, sort of what's called a hukm kulli, a sort of universal. We can look at, for example, different types of cats and still say, well, they're all cats, even though this is a different type of cat and this is a different type of cat. These are all different dogs. This is a German Shepherd, this is a Pit Bull, this is a Rottweiler, this is whatever it may be. But they're all dogs, despite the fact that they have these sort of subcategories, but they are all dogs. So, but that's a separate philosophical discussion, what comes first. But we have those universal concepts and they are really important for logic. In fact, the destruction of logic came really at the rejection of these universals. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. Somebody may be thinking, well, seems like a lot. It's not really. I'm not going to go into too much detail into that. You don't have to worry. But we will look at what a universal is. What does it mean for something to be a universal? When you say man, what do you mean by that? And again, that's the whole point of critical thinking and engaging with one's own mind. Prepositions involve composing or separating concepts in a subject, predicate, a mubtada, khabar, a mawdu', mahmul. These terms we'll all talk about. For those that have grammar, you know what I'm talking about with a mubtada and a khabar. This is like Zayd is standing. Zayd is the subject, the predicate is that is standing. That standing part is what we call a predicate. And so what is a predicate? How do you predicate? What is a correct way to predicate in order for you to actually say something about something? And what do you need to have in the level of certainty to be able to say something about something? And it's fascinating because the study of logic will make you rethink what you say. It really will. I can assure you that. Now, when you're talking to somebody, you become very, very gentle, because you begin to question even your own assumptions. You realize a lot of things that you hold are just assumptions, and you don't have any verification for those assumptions. And so you're making a statement about something. You're saying something is something or it's not something. Like, for example, when we say atheist, that when you say you are an atheist, an atheist, is a negative in Latin, which means not a theist. So that person is saying, I am an atheist, meaning I am not a theist. This is a qadiyya saliba, what we call a qadiyya saliba, and we'll talk more about that. Just a negative, it's just a negative statement. So you are, now in order for you to say something about something, for me to say I am a theist, and see, this is really interesting now. When I say I am a theist, I am saying that I have certainty in the existence of God. Why? Because when I predicate upon I, the subject, when I make that predication, that means I'm making a relation between me and theism, that I am a theist. So theism is the predicate, and I'm saying I am that. When I say that, like if I was to say Zayd is standing, okay, what level of certainty do you have? I can see. Okay, now certainty. So you have four things. And we're going to talk about this in more detail when we get there. But I have a subject, which is called Zayd. I have standing, which is the predicate. What the hukam, basically the judgment. I'm making a judgment on Zayd. I'm saying Zayd is standing. Then there's that relation, which is standing for Zayd. There's that between those two words or two terms. And then the fourth thing is my level of certainty. But let's say I don't know that, and I don't have no idea. How can I make that statement? Zayd is standing. How do you know? I don't know. So why did you say he is standing? Why would you make it's called a qadiyya mujiba? It's an affirmative statement. How could you affirm standing for Zayd when you don't know? I mean, it's not off topic, but let's correspond this to something in real life. Recently, many of you would have seen an interview with Piers Morgan and the spokesman for the Israeli government. Classic case. So he says to him, he's talking about how many. So the spokesman saying, we've killed this many terrorists. That's what he's calling them, right? This many terrorists, we've killed them. Okay, you've killed this many terrorists. So then he asks him a question. He says, how many civilians have you killed? And he says, oh, well, I don't know. And he says, well, what do you mean? And he goes, oh, because we can't know. It's the fog of war. Okay, so it's a fog of war, so you'd have certainty. So what is Piers questioning back? He says to him, well, how can you be so sure of how many combatants you've killed when you're not sure about how many civilians you killed? Like, why is it you're sure about one number, not the other number? And then if you watch the video, he goes silent. Because this is common sense, this is logic, which is, how can you make a statement about something when you don't have knowledge about it? You just said, we've killed this many combatants. How do you know? I don't know. So then why would you make a statement like that? How can you possibly make a statement like that? That's exactly this right now, which is you need those four aspects. You need the subject. You need what you're saying about the subject, the information. You need obviously the relationship between those two. And you also need certainty, or we'll talk about it, ghalabatu dhann. You need to have highly probable knowledge at the very least. So how can you make, so when somebody says, I'm an atheist, and then you ask the question and say, how can you prove that God does not exist? And someone like Dawkins responds and says, well, we can't prove that he doesn't exist, but we can't prove that he exists. Okay, so why then are you not an agnostic? Why are you an atheist? Why not just say, I, the subject, the mawdu', I, the subject, cannot take a predicate at this point of either yay or nay. I can't do that. Why? Because I have no certainty. So I can't make this relationship between me and theism or atheism. So I'm going to say I'm an agnostic, meaning I make a statement about it. That would be more epistemically responsible. But they don't. So you call yourself an atheist, so it's a contradiction. It's like me saying, Zayd has four heads. Zayd has four heads. Never seen one? Yeah, Zayd has four heads. How do you know? I don't know. But I'm going to make the statement anyway. No. That entire compound is considered like a single term. It's not considered an affirmation. Why? Because you need to have knowledge. Now this ties beautifully into the entire project of Kalam, of theology. Why? Because if you look at some of our works, what they mention is awwalu wajib. The first obligation upon man is what? Another. Is reflection. Is to learn. Why? Because they have to have certainty in their iman. Ana mu'min. This is why they had massive debates in the early part of Islam on, can I say ana mu'min insha'Allah? That statement, ana mu'min insha'Allah, I'm a believer if Allah wills. They had massive debates on that because you have to have certainty. So when I say ana mu'min, that is a qadiyya mujiba. That's an affirmative statement. I am saying that I have certainty in the relationship between faith and... Okay, you have certainty. Can you explain it? I don't know. I have no way of explaining it. I don't know. Actually, this is why, even though that such a person's faith is not rejected by the majority of scholars, they don't reject that person's faith, but they do say that person is a fasiq. That person is a sinner. Why? Because they say, بِتَشْكِيكِ الْمُشَكِّكِ يُشَكَّكْ. Yani, that person, through somebody causing them to doubt, will cause them to doubt, will make them to doubt. So such a person can easily be oscillating, mutadhabdhib, can be oscillating between and because they don't have certainty. They just don't. It's like when you speak to people, some people today, and they'll say, I'm half Muslim because my dad's Muslim. What does that mean? I'm a half a Muslim. How could you be half a Muslim? I udkhulu fi silmi katha. Like either you're entirely a Muslim or you're not. Why? Because when you say I'm a Muslim, that affirmation means something. It's meaningful. But in an age of postmodernism where meaning has been reduced to nothingness, then people can make such statements like I'm an atheist and have no way of backing it up, and nobody even questions. Why don't they question them? Is because they don't know logic. They don't know how important that is. It's the foundations of reasoning. طيب. These mental underline deductive or inductive reasoning forming the base of logic. We'll talk more about inductive reasoning, which basically you can say the scientific method falls into that. And what is the epistemic level of induction? Is there a type of induction that gives you certainty? Is there a type that doesn't? There are two types, for example. We'll look at that. In that, we'll bring in the discussion of the philosophy of science. We'll look at Kuhn and Popper and their argument with regards to what type of epistemic knowledge, really, what type of level of knowledge can science, meaning the scientific method, truly afford man? Can it give you certainty or not? Or what is deductive reasoning? All of those discussions. What is al-Burhan and how do the scholars understand that? That's all going to be very, very interesting, and inshallah ta'ala it'll be a good exercise, inshallah. What about the old woman who Razi told 70 proofs of God? And yes, but by the way, when I say iman, yaqeen, I don't mean that they have to know philosophy. You're talking about the old lady. What the old lady said? What's the quote? She said, oh, he needs this many proofs for the existence of God. I only need one. She had one. She had one. She wasn't proofless. She had one. For example, if you get some of our elders, grandparents, parents, and you say to them, how do you know Allah Ta'ala exists? And they'll be like, well, who made all of this? Because what the ulama say is that you have to have dala'il aqliya ijmaliya. You have to have rational proofs that are ijmali, meaning they're in summary. They don't have to be in great detail, but they have to be there in summary. Meaning at the very least, somebody has to say, well, I just can't fathom the fact that the entire universe could have come into being without a creator, and of course there must be Allah Ta'ala. And then I thought to myself, well, if there's a God, he must have communicated to us. Like what is that? He's obviously got a quote unquote, metaphorically speaking, I'm saying, he has a mind, meaning he has knowledge. That's their way of saying knowledge. And he obviously has knowledge. He obviously, chose to make, he would have communicated. And then I looked at the religions and I thought, well, Judaism doesn't really want you to convert. It's more of an ethnicity. And there are chosen people that come from a particular lineage. So that's really not much of an option. And beyond that, although they do have Tawheed, but they believe that Maimonides is greater than Moses. So a saint is greater than a prophet. And then I looked at the Old Testament and, Job is complaining for at least 8 pages in the Old Testament about why God, has given him illnesses and stuff. And it doesn't seem like a prophet. A prophet would be patient and honorable. So their view, and then look at Lot and his daughters and that whole story. For those of you that know what I'm talking about, there's incest. This is just, I don't know. I'm talking about me, for example. This is how I would reason it through. Again, I think to myself, and then on top of that, it is very specific, and they don't have a great view of prophets, and I don't really get it. And to be honest, they're not really welcoming any converts anyway. So that's not really fair. And furthermore, in Judaism, you don't really have to be a Jew to go to heaven. So Okay, that takes Judaism out, and they're the closest, because everyone else after that is just, you know, I mean, Christianity, I can't understand the idea of 3 and 1 and 1 and 3 because I studied logic, and that makes no sense. I also don't understand the idea that God's Son, na'udhu billah min dhalik, dies for my sins. I don't understand that. I also don't understand, at the very least, that the Bible wasn't authored by the people that it's named after, and the fact that we have no way of knowing that that's what Christ actually said. I've got no way of knowing that. And further, you know, so you forget, oh, there's prophecies about the Prophet ﷺ and all of that sort of stuff. As a text, I remember I was sat in, we went with the Cambridge Muslim College to Rome. We stayed for a week in a monastery, and it was just like immersion into understanding Catholicism. Really interesting, very, very informative experience. Met some amazing, interesting Christian theologians, and we would have dinner with them every single night. And I remember one, and this guy lived in Jordan. He spoke Arabic fluently. He understood Muslims in the West. He knew everybody, all the major institutes and people, and it was crazy. It was like no Muslim. It was like he was a Muslim. You know, he came down. He said to me, I was just listening to Sheikh Abdul Hakim, and his discussion on taqwa was really interesting. It's just really, really crazy, a sort of experience to think that he's a Christian. And I remember one of the things I said to him over dinner. I said to him that, you know, the New Testament, it is equivalent to what we call athar in our tradition, or what we call a hadith mawquf. Like what we call a hadith mawquf, or what some scholars call an athar, which is basically aqwal al-sahaba. Aqwal al-sahaba, which is in terms of epistemic value, I mean, it's there, but it's not very high. You have the Quran, the sarih nas of the Quran. You have the mutawatir ahadith, the massively transmitted narrations from the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Then you have the ahad, which are sahiha, and moving down into what's hasan li dhatihi, then hasan li ghayrihi, etc. Then you have the weak ahadith, but then you have the aqwal al-sahaba that are used as sort of a third or fourth level of evidence to support certain positions, and that's your actual revelation. And the only thing that you got to survive on is being filled with the Holy Ghost, which in our language we call kashf. And for our theologians, kashf is not acceptable in theology. Why? It's acceptable for you individually. That's different. If you were to see, for example, the Holy Prophet, even though this isn't necessarily kashf, but if you were to see the Holy Prophet ﷺ in your dream, and he was to command you to do something, that's binding on you, but it's not binding on me, because I can't verify it. It's not falsifiable. We can't objectively know it. I can't guarantee that you're not lying. But you saw the Prophet, and the devil can't take his image. So if you saw him in your dream, then you've actually seen him as he taught us, alayhi salatu wasalam. So now it's binding you. But objectively, as a theology, it's not acceptable. So the Holy Ghost is not acceptable. You interpret your Bible, your priest does, and he tells everyone to do what he wants, and this is how you have occult leaders. So from a very, very basic epistemic position, I don't trust Christianity. And then I don't trust its theology, that's for sure. I don't trust its conception of God. It's shirk in the finest form. And then what have you got? Buddhism doesn't believe in God. They have Nirvana and enlightenment. They don't have God. Hinduism is polytheism. What have you got left? And so actually, if you think about it, all the things that I said are very simple. They don't require huge amounts of mental gymnastics for you to come to Islam, which genuinely has an absolutely beautiful and pure theology. No partners with Allah Ta'ala. The concept of every single ta'thir in the universe is His, and everything are asbab. It has a beautiful view of prophets. The prophets are sinless and do not make mistakes in the sharia, or in tabligh or anything like that. They are perfect in their memory, and they're handsome, they're beautiful, they're akhlaq. All of that is wonderful. They bring miracles. Islam has miracles. The miracles of the Prophet are mutawatira. It's unbelievable for someone to deny it. It's like, no, even a kafir will not deny that the adhan is from the time of the Prophet. Muslims have been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the time of the Prophet, in every part from Africa to India to Andalusia to, wherever it may be, to North Africa to all the way to Saudi Arabia. They've been doing this adhan. Yes, and we've also been mentioning these miracles equally. So why is it you would, as a historian or as a normal person, accept the adhan as being massively transmitted but not miracles? So from that perspective, Even the scholars and saints of Islam, their character, I mean, they're a hujjah. This is why Al-Ghazali mentions that faith enters sometimes just by looking at the face of a wali, of a saint, because they're a hujjah of Allah on this earth. Some of these people, they are, because they remind you of the prophets. Look at the Sahaba, the transformative nature. May Allah Ta'ala protect our iman. And may Allah Ta'ala protect us from going astray. May Allah Ta'ala protect us from falling off the deen. And may Allah protect us from falling into doubt. And may Allah Ta'ala not make our tests in our iman. And Allah protect our iman, the iman of our communities, our families, our children, their children until Yawm al-Qiyamah. And we pray that Allah Ta'ala does not allow anyone, and we do not say this with any type of arrogance, only with certainty, not with any type of humble before Allah Ta'ala, that our hearts are between the metaphorically speaking, the two fingers of the most merciful. And He can He can guide whom He wants and misguide whom He wants. And we do not ask for Allah Ta'ala any tests in that, nor do we speak pompously as if we have achieved all guidance for ourselves now. Everything is a gift from the Maker subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's all a gift from the most merciful Jalla fil Ula, by the karam and the jud and the efforts of our Master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who gave us this religion, and the great Muslims that transmitted it. And we are indebted to all of them. We hold our hands up high and say, Ya Rab, it was you that guided us to this. Otherwise we would not have been guided. Only from the perspective of ni'mah, of telling of the blessings of Allah Ta'ala. وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَتِكَ فَحَدِّثْ, as Allah commands us to do, to tell of our blessings and to say that we have certainty in our iman, but not from a place of arrogance or pompous, hasha wa kalla, may Allah protect us, that we say, that's all we need for certainty in Islam. That's all we need. It's as simple as that. I haven't found anything that matches up to it, and I don't think anyone will. And anyone else that's doing it, it's a leap of faith in Islam. Alhamdulillah, we use our aql. Anyway, moving on from that tangent, but it was an important tangent, because you appreciate this, barakallahu fikum, you appreciate just how important this is. So, talking about the old lady, she had one proof, and that was enough. Ijmal, summary, sufficient. Tafsil, detail, not needed unless somebody goes into doubt. Wa nas'alallahu ta'ala al-afiyah. We ask Allah Ta'ala for protection. Okay, logical and analytical inquiry into these acts of the mind, aiding sound reasoning. Its foundations include the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and that's going to be an interesting one, because there's been some contemporary discussion on the law of non-contradiction, whether it's actually a law or not. So that'll be interesting. And the excluded middle, rooted in self-evident truths. We're going to look at first principles. All of that, inshallah ta'ala, hopefully, we'll cover. Okay, the founder, Al-Wadi'. Who's the person that founded the subject? Firstly, reasoning is innate to humanity, guiding our actions. It's common knowledge, common sense. We've always had it. In the Islamic tradition, logic was first developed by the ancient scholars, about whom we will speak shortly. Aristotle formalized logic in his work, the organon, which literally means al-ala. It means a tool. Al-Farabi in 961, that's very early by the way, Al-Farabi introduced logic into the Islamic civilization. Al-Kindi also had a role to play in this after him, but Ibn Sina has been by and large significant. So this is again very early, 428 in the Hijri calendar, and this is 1037 in the Gregorian calendar, common era ya'ni, provided an encyclopedic work covering logic, natural science, mathematics and metaphysics. Here's an image on the right of the translation by the famous Marmara, who translated the Hafatul Falasifa as well. This is his Ash-Shifa. Ibn Sina wrote a book called Al-Shifa, in which he deals with natural science, mathematics, metaphysics, and logic. And that text of logic was translated into Latin, and his book in the section in medicine. We will be finishing in no longer than 10 minutes. 10 minutes and we're finished. Barakallahu fiqh. So this section is, and then that he developed, he added sections into it. In fact, I have some work that I'll give you maybe as a reading material for those that on Wednesday, I will give you a handout on the additions of, for those that are interested. Again, if you're a beginner, don't worry about it. But if you're a little bit more advanced and you're interested, I will give you reading on Ibn Sina's additions to logic, what he actually introduces to logic. Then Imam al-Ghazali refined Ibn Sina's work, producing five logic texts and varying difficulty that are still in use today. And there were many others. Qutbuddin al-Razi, for example, very important. Even Fakhruddin al-Razi, Imam al-Razi himself, but Qutbuddin al-Razi, really important in developing his Tawali' is an encyclopedic work. He also has his Matan, famously known as that's taught in Dars al-Nizami, but really important scholars developed this subject. Okay, relation to other subjects, nisbah. What this diagram is on the right, you will learn it inshallah ta'ala when we are. Logic is a universal science encompassing concepts, propositions, arguments. It stands apart as sui generis, meaning it's separate to all of the subjects. Here's a nice quote from Fazl Imam Khairabadi from the Mirqat. Logic protects the mind when considered from errors in reasoning. I thought I'll just put that in there as a nice quote from the great Imam Fazl Imam Khairabadi, the author of the Mirqat, the second or third, depending, text normally taught in Dars al-Nizami. Virtue, fada'il. Logic is a foundational science integral to all other disciplines. It is considered a necessary preliminary subject, ensuring intellectual rigor. We've covered this. While other science may surpass it in terms of ends, meaning fiqh is more virtuous than logic, of course it is. Aqidah is more virtuous than logic, of course it is. Tafsir is more virtuous than it. Hadith is more virtuous than it. All of it is more virtuous than it. However, this science is a means to ensure sound knowledge in all of those other subjects. Then what is the hukm shar'i? One qawl is recommended. Most theologians, legal theorists, meaning usuliyun, and many fuqaha, jurists, consider the study of logic recommended. Scholars such as Al-Ghazali, Ibn Al-Arafa, Al-Ubbi and As-Sanusi support this view, which is deemed the soundest by many. Now this is going to require a little bit more, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. Secondly, permitted, according to, because why I say that is because they say recommended for everyone, but for some people it's wajib, it's fard, and I'll explain that. Permitted, according to Taqiyuddin al-Subki, Shaykh al-Islam, logic is permitted for those with sound intellects and knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah. Mumaras al-Sunnati wal-Kitabi, as he says, right? We'll look at that later. Collective obligation. Some scholars like Al-Qushayri consider the study of logic to be a collective obligation, fard kifaya, like have to do it. Knowledge of the qira'at, the various readings of the Quran, it's a fard kifaya. Some people have to know it. A view mentioned by Al-Ajhuri and Zarqani Zarqani in their commentaries on the Mukhtasar of Al-Khalil in Maliki fiqh. Prohibited. There are scholars who prohibit the study of logic, although this view is less common. And let's have a quick read of that. Individual or collective obligation. Some scholars argue that the obligation to study logic is individual, as sound knowledge of God relies upon sound reasoning. Others suggest it is a collective obligation, as protecting religious beliefs require the use of reason. This view is supported by Imam Al-Yafi'i and Hujjatul Islam. So that's the position generally of these Imams. Prohibition, those that say it's haram, like Ibn Salah al-Nawawi, As-Suyuti and Ibn Taymiyyah. Now with Ibn Taymiyyah there will be some discussion for now. Initially prohibited preoccupation with logic, however they clarified that this prohibition pertains to philosophical logic. This is logic that includes falsafa, because they were not fond of philosophy, particularly its metaphysical foundations and false conclusions. So for example, they didn't like Al-Baydawi, because Al-Baydawi's mantiq text includes a lot of hikmah in it, a lot of wisdom, a lot of philosophy in it, so they didn't like it. So they said it's essential, and that the subject is essential but should be purified of any underground epistemic speculations. MashaAllah. Ahlan wa sahlan. Yeah, representing the Malikiyya, mashallah. Okay, conclusion. The North African tradition is very important in Kalam, by the way, which is why it's really interesting what's happening in Morocco now. The Salafization of Morocco is very interesting. And I could talk a lot about that, about the commentaries, contemporary commentaries, for example, on Al-Akhdari, but that's a separate conversation if you're interested. Okay, conclusion. The prohibition against logic was actually against philosophical logic. Once this was clarified, the prohibition became invalid. Logic in its purified form remains a valuable tool in the pursuit of knowledge. Now, we're right at the end now. So this was a summary of from the Suleiman Manawraq. وَالْخُلْفُ فِي جَوَازِ الْإِشْتِغَالِ بِهِ عَلَى ثَلَاثَةِ أَقْوَالِ. Three positions of is it permissible. فَابْنُ الصَّلَاحِ وَالنَّوَاوِ حَرَّمَا وَقَالَ قَوْمًا يَنْبَغِي أَنْ يُعْلَمَا. So Ibn Salah, Nawawi and Suyuti, others considered it to be haram, whilst a group said it was necessary to be known, Al-Ghazali. And then he gives his own fatwa, which isn't exactly correct. Remember, of the Sulam, he wrote the Sulam when he was 17 or 16. So he was a young man when he wrote this. The majority, the popular position is jaiz, but for the one with intelligence, not just someone with intelligence, mumaris sunnati wal kitabi li yahtadi bihi ila sawabi. The one that is deep in the Quran and Sunnah, and this is just to be able to be used as a tool to get to what is correct. So meaning that the person cannot be a philosopher, they have to use it for the aid of the deen and the pure of the philosophy that they don't like, and such logic was permissible for them. But as I say, it's a fard kifaya as the official position. It's a kifaya, some scholars have to know it, but generally speaking, the ulama say everyone needs to know a level of knowledge. Why? Because the knowledge of God is based upon it. And why that is, if you're a Kalam student, then you know. Okay, here's a text. Now, we're not going to be reading off this manuscript. I just did this because it was the first lesson, and we're only reading the muqaddimah to finish off the lesson. We're not going into the text. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but let me get a laser pointer on here. So if you can see that here, the word al-lafdhu ad-dalu ala tamami ma wudi'a lahu bil-mutabaqa. This is where the actual text begins, the meat, the discussion of the relationship between words and meaning. This is just the muqaddimah we are going to read for the barakah. So here he says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And again, this manuscript might not necessarily correlate with the translation. Qala al-Shaykh al-Imam. So he says, the great Shaykh, the great Imam, al-Allama, which is, as you know, it's a template of mubalagha, meaning that the erudite, the very, very learned scholar, afdal al-mutaakhirina, the most superior of the later scholars, qudwat al-hukama al-rasikhina, the sort of the role model, exemplar for the deeply rooted hukama, philosophers, or logicians, even you can translate this as. Athiruddin al-Tayyib Allahu tharahu, may Allah sent his resting place, وَجَعَلَ الْجَنَّةَ مَثْوَاهُ, and make paradise his final abode. Then he says نَحْمَدُ. Now you can see in the manuscript there's actually a mistake that the scribe makes. He said نَحْمَدُهُ, and so he's taken that out, and he says نَحْمَدُ اللَّهَ ta'ala. So we praise Allah the Exalted, ala tawfiqihi, on his divine facilitation, which is Allah ta'ala corresponding with our acquiring of this knowledge, the actual gifting of knowledge, because remember, all causality is ultimately his subhanahu wa ta'ala. So tawfiq has a very specific meaning for Sunnis, which we'll talk more about. And he says, وَنَسْأَلَهُ هِدَايَةَ, in one of the manuscripts, tariqihi, and we ask of him, Allah, hidayah tariqihi, the guidance to his path, subhanahu tabaraka wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَنُصَلِّ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ, and we send blessings upon his messenger Muhammad, وَآلِهِ وَأَصْحَابِهِ وَعِتْرَتِهِ. Now this is a translation from the one that you'll be given in the document on hopefully inshallah by Tuesday night. But this is this manuscript. So, and we send prayers upon his messenger Muhammad, his people, al now. Why are we making that separation? I don't want to go into right now, but when itra, family, is mentioned specifically, then we translate al as people, his nation. But if itra isn't mentioned, the scholars say, then al could mean his family or it could mean his people. In any case, so upon Muhammad, upon his nation, upon his companions, and upon his family. Wa ba'd. And as to what follows after praising Allah and salutations upon the Prophet, he says, فَهَذِهِ, this is risalatun, an epistle, fil mantiq, in logic. أَوْرَدَنَا فِيهَا, we have placed or deposited within it, مَا يَجِبُ اسْتِحْضَارُ, what having in your mind ready is necessary. Meaning the absolute fundamentals of logic that you must have, we have put that in this text. For whom? لِمَنْ يَبْتَدِئَ شَيْئًا is put. In the other manuscript, it's لِمَنْ يَبْتَدِئَ فِي شَيْءٍ مِنَ الْعُلُومِ, for the one that is beginning in anything from any knowledge. You want to study grammar, you want to study whatever it is, this is the beginning place. إِنَّهُ مُفِيدُ الْخَيْرِ, indeed he, Allah, is the gifter of al-khair, all goodness, and al-jud, all generosity. Isaghoji. What does that word mean? Is it a Greek word? What's the history of it? What's the history of the earliest known Greek author that had a book called Isaghoji? That information will kickstart off the next lesson, and then in the following lesson we will inshallah ta'ala be looking at the relationship between terms and meanings, building up to the discussion of the universals, and then moving into definitions inshallah ta'ala. طيب. هذا ما عندي والله تعالى أعلم بالصواب.